Hi, thank you for joining me today. We are talking about these variegated yarns. Let me introduce myself first. I am Pauliina, also known as Lina, and I'm a knitwear designer based in Helsinki, Finland. I design engaging and meditative knitting patterns. I like to call them knitting patterns for your soul. On this channel, I share my designs, my tips and tricks, and chat about knitting in general, which is what we're doing today. I guess a combination of all of them actually. I know quite a few knitters who love variegated yarns and in all their different forms. I just grabbed these off from the top of my stash pile, and most of these are quite old. To be honest, I don't think I've acquired new variegated yarns recently. That's not true. I did, and I knitted with it. I'm gonna share that in a second. But yeah, and these are quite a few of these are sock yarns, so just easy stockinette sock yarns. But then I have something like this as well. This is 200 grams of DK weight yarn. They're just so beautiful, aren't they? With all the different colors. They're like candy or a mysterious forest. It's just, sometimes they're just irresistible, but they can be a bit tricky to knit with. So I thought I would sit down with you today and just go through different kind of patterns or projects that you could use them for, and let them sort of shine and sort of be the star of the show. Sometimes what happens is that you pick a gorgeous pattern and get your gorgeous variegated multicolored skeins, and they just don't, the end result is something that doesn't do justice to the pattern and doesn't do justice to the yarn. So in case this is something that you might be struggling with, or that you just have like one skein and don't want to knit another pair of plain stockinette stitch socks, so what could you use them for? The simple rule is look for patterns that have clean lines and simple stitch patterns. So no intricate cables or intricate lace patterns. Those tend to get lost in the color shifts of the yarn. What knitters tend to mostly have, myself included, like I stated, is to have single skein of these. But in case you have multiple skeins of the same yarn, or you really want to knit a whole sweater with variegated yarns because you just love the colors in some of them, you found a colorway that you just really love all of the colors and you'd love to have it in a larger canvas, so to speak. What you could do then is look for patterns, sweater patterns that have really simple lines like this. And throughout this video, I'm just gonna throw it out here. Throughout, I'm gonna be using my own patterns as examples because that's just what I have available and that's what I know intimately. So I can confidently share those and use those as samples. But yes, so my Angel Aura Quartz sweater that I'm wearing, and that's in my new book, Soothing Stitches. This is a very, at the bottom of it, this has a very simple structure to it. So if you just leave out the striped bits, the different colored stripes here, and just use the pattern with the DK weight yarn, you're gonna get a sweater that has mostly stockinette stitch, the variegated yarn to shine. And you can do this with any sweater pattern. Just I think easiest are, of course, sweater patterns that don't have anything, but if you fall in love, if you see a striped pattern, you can just use that without doing the striping and just continue with that one yarn. So look for sweaters that have clean lines and nothing too frilly about them. So skip all of the lace sweaters and the cable sweaters, but just look for basic sweaters and cardigans. And also remember that when you're doing a gauge swatch with variegated yarns, you are knitting, the rows are quite short. And then when you're knitting sweaters or shawls or anything with larger rows, the yarn is gonna act differently. So while you can use, of course, use this gauge watch to measure your gauge and get an idea of what the colors will look like knitted up, spread out, it might be a bit of a different effect. All right, moving on. One of my favorite ways to use variegated yarns is to pair them with solid colored yarns. And I've done that in several projects that I've done and some of the designs that I've done. For example, this is quite an old design of mine, Memory Keeper shawl. This one has a gray yarn running throughout, and I'm always pairing it with, well, this is a scrap yarn shawl. All of the scrap yarns that I've used are different variegated ones. As you can see, the same gray yarn runs throughout, and then I've used different scraps for that. This does take up more than one skein, so you could, instead of using scraps, use two variegated skeins. So from here you can see how the sort of the base color doesn't really come up that much, but it sort of tones down the variegation, but still lets the different colors come up and shine. And this is also an example of simple stitch patterns. So there is garter stitch, stockinette stitch, and moss stitch here, which is the bit of eyelets. So all of those work, give a slightly different effect. The moss stitch breaks up the variegation a bit better, whereas in the stockinettes you can sort of see segments and a slight striping happening. And then I've got socks. This is called Winterlight, the pattern, and the pattern photos are with a pair of socks that's just dark blue, a solid dark blue. But I've knit two pairs of this, doing a combination of actually 3 fingering weight sock yarns. And here, for example, I think all of them are variegated, and they just add end up as a medley of colors. I've worn these a lot, so I'm sorry they do look a bit worn and pilly, but you can just see how I chose skeins that had colors that complemented each other or were sort of from the same color family. So the end result is busy, but I still really like them. And then there's the other pair that I'm actually wearing today, and here one of the yarns that I used was a gradient yarn. So you can see that one of the socks has a cuff that's a very pale, and then it turns into a darker colors. So they're different kind of variegated yarns. They're the ones where the yarns are just all, they don't make any patterns, and there are the sort of, when the color transitions from one color to another and then another and doesn't return back to where it was before. And then there are sort of more speckled colors where there's a clear base color and then just little pops, little bits, dots, speckles of other colors in them. And then there are, of course, self-striping yarns, and I think the self-striping ones are really best for just knitting stockinette stitch socks, but of course you can experiment with them on other patterns as well. Then another way to use variegated yarns with solid colors is to stripe them, and I've got examples of that one as well, or patterns that could work for that. And one of them is again my scrap yarn pattern, Walk With Me socks. There are segments here where I've paired a solid color with a variegated color, like here, and then below as well. It's actually the same variegated color paired with 2 different solids. Actually, the other one isn't solid, it's also variegated, which quite works. And then it continues to being with the red. But I especially like this bit where they're distinct colors but still sort of complement each other, and the blue stripes really tone down the variegated stripes, but then the stripes are the 3 rows high, so they do let the color shifts show up. So a really nice way to use those as well. And yeah, if you have a striped or variegated skein and then a solid skein of sock yarn and you pair them up, you can definitely get like knee-high socks. Really cool knee-high socks. Then I've knit, this is my light as air shawl, and this one I've used a solid color and then a speckled color, but I think it would work with even a more variegated color as the second color. I wouldn't do both, but the other one. So there are stripes and then simple enough lace. And I think an even better if you want to use a widely variegated. This one works well for the speckled one, but if you want to use a wildly variegated, then I would look for something where stripes are the main attraction, sort of like this cloud shadow shawl. This is with 2 solid colors, as you can see, but changing one of these for a more variegated one would be okay. It does have a bit of lace, so you could do that with the solid color. That's what I would choose. And just use sort of like instead of this gray stripe, I would use the variegated for that one. And yeah, I would definitely, I think it would work better if in something like this, the variegated yarn would be paler than the solid color yarn. So there's always things like that to play with. Then if your variegated is very dark colors and you want to do the striping, then I would choose something like pure white or natural white or something to contrast with that. Another option would be to pick one of the colors from the variegated skein and use that as your solid if you can find a close match. That does mean that the stripes wouldn't be as clearly defined, but it would again be something to tone down the variegation a bit, because in large swatches the very widely variegated yarns can be quite overpowering. So in case that's something you're concerned with or something that you find that you're not sure if you like, then these are the options that you can do to sort of tone it down a bit and yeah, bring out the best of it. Then there are, of course, patterns that are designed for variegated yarn. So if you're browsing for patterns on Ravelry, look for patterns where the pattern picture shows a sample with variegated yarn. And I did just that again with Soothing Stitches, one of the patterns in Soothing Stitches. These are the malachite socks. So these are for variegated sock yarn, obviously. And I just wanted to switch up from knitting just stockinette stitch yarns. And this is the skein that I fell in love with and just wanted to design with. So I used a very simple stitch pattern that sort of lets the variegated yarn shine through, but that still shows up that it's not just a bunch of variegated yarn, but it's a sock with a stitch pattern, and you can clearly see that. From this, you can also see the difference between just stockinette stitch, like this, and then with the stitch pattern, how the yarn behaves a bit differently when it's broken up with different kind of stitches. And then I think this is mostly for the speckled yarns, but look for patterns that are mostly stockinette stitch but have a bit of color work. You can even try that one. So I've done the October moon socks that have bats in the cuff. I've got two versions of it. So bats in the cuff, and then mostly stockinette stitch with, and I've used speckled yarn here. For this and other sort of color work on top of variegated yarn, I would recommend using pale variegated, or like variegated yarns with pale colors, and them not too strong, not too bright, not too dark. So you can then use a dark solid color to highlight the or to do the color work or the color work pattern with. I can't talk today. So you can then use a solid color to do the color work pattern with, and it will show up nicely. Here actually my dark color isn't solid either, but I think it still works. Some of the smaller elements get a bit lost, but the bats show up quite nicely since all of the colors in the variegated are really dark as well. Why the smaller, you can see them here, the small sections here, why they get lost here is that some of the colors in the dark color are the same color as the speckles. So pay attention to those things. But yes, so variegated yarns can even work in color work, but I wouldn't do any complicated color work, just more like these simple add-ons. I don't know if that's probably not a technical knitting term, but I hope you understand what I mean. And then just one last example actually is to do slip stitches. When I was gathering all of the nets that I've shown you so far, my eye caught on this one. And this is my new Paths shawl, again, something that's quite a few years old. Now, granted, this shawl isn't widely variegated. It's maybe more just a tonal. So it's the same shade of purple in different tones throughout the shawl, or the skein, sorry. But it does have this stitch pattern that could work with even more variegated yarns. So again, it's very simple and it has slip stitches. And I think slipped stitches would have the same effect as, sorry, I was looking for the memory keeper shawl, but I've thrown it too far away to reach it. The slipped stitches pattern has the same effect as the seed stitch pattern in that it sort of breaks up the variegation. Here in the stockinette stitch, you can see that it ever so slightly has a bit of a striping effect, which is what tends to happen because of how the yarns are dyed. But the slip stitch sections are just a more clear or more solid, solid block of just the different hues together, if you can see what I mean. So to summarize everything, look for clean lines, simple stitch patterns, and use solid colors if you're doing something larger than just a pair of socks, or even within the socks. Use a solid color to pair it with, sort of break up the intensity and the variegated skeins. And then look for simple stitch patterns to sort of break up the striping that can happen, and also that can just makes it into a confetti, like, even if it's not speckled, or it creates this confetti-like effect. So seed stitch and slipped stitch patterns are good for this. Any stitch patterns that use a combination of stitch and purl, knit and purl stitches. I don't know what is it with the words today. But yes, all of the patterns will be linked below. These are some of my suggestions, my tips. Ultimately, the choice is of course yours. There are no rules for what's right and what's wrong in knitting. As long as you're happy with the result, then that's all that matters. So listen to yourself, trust yourself, and boldly try things, even if other people think that they're not gonna work. They might be the most awesome thing ever. If you'd like to get more knitting inspiration, you should watch my scrap yarn video next. I'm sure you would enjoy that one as well. And thank you so much for watching. If this was useful for you, if you enjoyed this, give it a thumbs up. It really helps. Subscribe, and I will see you soon again. Thank you. Bye.